I still can't believe he said this. It was the most obscene thing I've ever heard from any subject I've ever photographed. And he said, David Bailey, 2011. I finally got to photograph him. I mean, it's a bit like being a session musician and being asked to play with the Rolling Stones. You know, this man loomed large on my photographic landscape. I was hugely influenced by Irving Penn and Richard Avedon. And I had that in common with Bailey because Bailey used that technique, the technique that they mastered in order to document the 60s and produce a definitive body of work, which really he's kind of dined out on ever since. Those pictures he took of Mick Jagger and the craze and the people that kind of made up the cultural landscape of the 60s are iconic. He is one of a holy trinity of photographers that are important in the UK. You've got Don McCullum, you've got Martin Parr, and you've got David Bailey. They are kind of people who are enormously influential in their separate fields, and they're actually three people that I've photographed. Don McCullum lives in Bruton, and I went to photograph him around the same sort of time. And Martin Parr, Bristol, all in the southwest actually. Martin Parr was probably the most intimidating, and the picture I like the most of him, we'll do a video on him at some point, was with his wife Susie. I think I was probably most intimidated by him because he's been the biggest influence more recently on my career. But initially, I'd say it was David Bailey. I was like everybody else at college. I was just photographing stuff around me. I was sort of developing an understanding of composition. At some point, I saw the pictures that influenced David Bailey, you know, Irving Penn and Richard Avedon. And then I saw Bailey's pictures and I started copying them. Instead of shooting on 35mm, I borrowed a Hasselblad. The course I was on was so lowly, you weren't really meant to use medium format, but I borrowed this Hasselblad.
Why was it lonely?
It was just considered, it's an OND. I did an OND, not an HND, an OND. As my dad used to say, that and 75p will get you a cup of coffee. It was of no consequence whatsoever. Most of my assistants have degrees or masters in photography, and take that as a lesson. You don't need accreditation in this world of photography. Your accreditation is your portfolio. But getting back to David Bailey, I was full of trepidation because it felt like I'd come full circle. And so, and I was photographing him in my own manner because by this stage, I was living in Devon. And so I traveled down to Dartmoor. He has this farm on Dartmoor, into the lion's den to photograph this kind of person who was a huge part of my kind of photographic journey. And initially, it was quite tense. I think he was getting the measure of me, and so I left the cameras in the camera bag. And I remember we had a cafetiere of coffee, and we sat in the kitchen with his wife, my assistant Emily, and me and Bailey, and we just chatted about photography. And over that time, probably about an hour and a half, we were chatting. I think he sort of could see that I was okay. We talked about Irving Penn, Avedon. He didn't really like modern photographers. He didn't really have anything positive to say about any of my contemporaries.
What about you?
He'd not heard of me. No, I mean, if he had, he wasn't going to sort of give me the satisfaction. After a while, I could see him warming. And after that, it was brilliant. It was brilliant. We sort of went out in his garden and we took all these pictures of him walking around, and we took pictures everywhere. And he was really generous with his time. I remember his daughter was there. I think she's called Paloma, probably named after Picasso's daughter. He definitely had sort of lofty ideas about his place within the artist establishment. I like that because when I photographed Snowden, he was really disparaging about photography.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, so Snowden said he only became a photographer because he couldn't paint. Whereas Bailey, the reason we were interviewing him, Lynn Barber was doing the interview, was they had an exhibition of his paintings and they were quite vulgar. I mean, they were basically sort of quite explicit images with female genitalia. I was quite surprised that they ran in the Sunday Times. I think they were quite abstract, so nobody realised that they were kind of depictions of vaginas and the like. But basically, is an advocate of photography. He loves photography, and he was unapologetic about comparing himself with Picasso. Or I think he probably realised that Picasso's on another level, but he took himself seriously, and that's to his credit.
So when you're photographing Snowden, you said you were quite intimidated, just because he's an incredible photographer in his own right,
Mm,
and you thought maybe he was judging your technique or something like that. Did you find that was the case
yeah,
with Rank? No, David Bailey.
not ranking. No, I had a. It was interesting. I think I'd evolved as a person. So when I shot Snowden, I was shooting on film, and I was probably just a little bit more insecure. You get more soulful as you get older. You get more chilled. So when I was photographing Bailey, I shot it all on digital. It was a Canon 5D, and I felt I had every right to be there. I felt I was his equal. Maybe I'm deluding myself.
No imposter syndrome.
No, absolutely. So he knew what I was doing. He could see that I was in control of the medium, and I had a clear idea of what I wanted to do. We wound up in his studio that he created in this barn. An interesting, I've talked about this in the Zadie Smith video, I think, how I used what I tend to look for is a frame within a frame. So he had all his canvases, all his paintings, and I found a blank canvas and I sort of placed it behind Bailey, in amongst all this detritus, all this stuff, and it sort of makes that frame within a frame. And then I saw that Catherine, his wife, who's very beautiful, she used to be a model, was sort of holding the canvas, I think, and I left her in it, and then I got his dog, which was perversely called Pig, on his lap, and it was telling that you could tell he's a photographer, because quite often when people are holding their animals, when you photo, we should do a whole video about people and pets and photographing
Yeah,
people.
a lot of people I've spoken to around us, other photographers, say that's something you're really good at is with
Yeah,
pets.
yeah. Well, I didn't have to tell Bailey that I didn't want him holding the dog too heavily, because the hands are very revealing in a photograph. I mean, if he's gripping the dog,
It's too contrived.
it's too contrived, and that was the reason that Catherine is laughing in the picture. And I still can't believe he said this, but I I don't know if I've told you this, but Bailey, it was the most obscene thing I've ever heard from any subject I've ever photographed. I was sort of blowing smoke up his arse and sort of telling him how great he was and what a fantastic picture it was. But he probably would have known it was a good picture. And I said, and the icing on the cake is that you're holding the dog so lightly, and the dog looks like it's happy to be there. And I said, have you got a great rapport with Pig? What's your secret? And he said, I've got my finger up her cunt.
Oh my God. Okay.
And it was like there was an awkward silence, and then everybody just started laughing. But it was wrong on so many levels. I mean, it was just a bizarre but very memorable. It was my Bailey story. I've spoke to so many people who've been photographed by Bailey, and people call him Bailey, and everyone's got a story like that. He likes to shock. He likes to get a reaction. That's part of. I mean, my photography is more sedate and controlled, and I think more probably influenced by Irving Penn. With Bailey, there's an element of anarchy that he creates
I
by
mean, if
by
he's
saying things like that.
yeah, I mean, if he's shooting someone, he says something like that, you'll definitely get a genuine reaction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a completely bizarre and strange thing to say.
They don't meet your heroes, but in this case, it seems like it went well.
Yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, Don McCullum, I was quite intimidated by. He's a serious and maybe a little morose character. I really liked him, and at one point I took his picture, and it was sort of reflected in the dark room door, the glass of the dark room door, and Don McCullen sort of said to me, I showed him on the back of the camera, and he said, "Now that's my kind of picture." And I
Oh,
said to him, obviously I'm going to be telling this story and dining out on it, that the great Don McCullen said that. And Martin Parr was probably the most difficult, because he gave me an hour, and subsequently he's been very nice about my book.
he worked with you for it, didn't he? Or he gave you a.
He gave me a really nice quote for Survivor, but I think he's a very straightforward person, and it's very he knows, he keeps his boundaries, and he's very rigorous. So he said that we would have an hour, and we had precisely an hour. I mean, his wife made a cake, and we enjoyed the cake and everything. And I sort of thought, we're getting on well. We're friends. This is great. But it didn't. I thought perhaps I'd get more than an hour, but it wasn't going to happen. Whereas with Bailey, now Bailey said to me, "Do you want to stay the night?"
Oh wow.
Which is really. I mean, it would have been really weird. I mean, it's a beautiful farmhouse full of beautiful antiques and so on.
He's obviously really enjoying chatting about
I
photography
would
with
have
you.
loved to have stayed the night, but the following day I had to run up to London and get on a flight, an overnight flight, and photograph Oscar Pistorius for the
Oh,
cover of Outside magazine. So I couldn't. It was in Devon. It was in Dartmoor. So I had to. I went straight from Bailey's shoot, got in my car. I dropped Emily off because she lived in Devon, and I was straight up the motorway and then on a flight. So
wow.
I couldn't stay, and that's actually yeah, that was really kind of him. The other thing is that throughout, when I was taking pictures of him, he was photographing me, and I'd love to have a David Bailey portrait of me, but maybe I should get in contact with him. I'll
Yeah,
send this
ask
video
him
to him.
for sure.
Yeah, that would be cool. I mean, it was interesting insight actually, because he told me that, I mean, it shows that if you produce something truly special, and those pictures in the 60s were special, and he was part of a scene. He married Catherine Deneuve, who was probably one of the most beautiful women in the world. I mean, he's had these relationships with extraordinary women, and he kind of is a national treasure, to the extent that he said that he just basically does private commissions, portrait sessions, tens of thousands of pounds. Probably a bit indiscreet me saying this, but you know, now people just want to be David Bailey'd.
Yeah, David Bailey.
Yeah,
So I mentioned, well, accidentally, like Freudian slipped, Rankin earlier, and I think Rankin also was probably like you and inspired by David Bailey
100%.
and Avedon and Penn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So how do you compare yourself to Bailey, to Rankin?
I'd say that.
If you both have the same kind of sources when it comes to
Yeah, I mean,
inspiration.
I think Rankin's has a much better grasp of the business of marketing and PR. I mean, it was a genius move starting Dazed and Confused, grabbing the means of production, you know, I think he sort of says that he couldn't get any commissions. I mean, I got commissions, so I didn't need to start my own magazine, but he was struggling to get commissions, so he avoided the gatekeepers and started Dazed and Confused.
Gave himself the commissions.
Absolutely, and he's created some iconic imagery along the way, and he's I can see that he would probably like to be the heir apparent of David Bailey, and perhaps you could make that case that he was documenting the 90s in the same way that Bailey was documenting the 90s, but in relation to, I mean, as my mum used to say, comparisons are odious.
Okay. And have you shot Rankin?
I've met Rankin a few times, but
Okay.
I've not photographed him.
Okay.
One thing I did have as an advantage with Bailey was that I assisted John Swanell. And John Swanell famously was Bailey's assistant. And he's another, very well known photographer from the 80s when I was starting. I worked on commercials with John. In fact, I was working on a commercial with John Swanell. This was the last time I ever worked for John Swanell. It was a Timotei advert, and I was in charge of Russia's transport. So at the end of the working day, me assisting John Swanell and working as a runner,
How
I
old are
would
you here?
I was probably about your age or younger. At the end of that working day, I would get into a hire car and drive the film that they'd shot, because it was shot on film, because it was a commercial, it was an advert. down to Technicolor, get it processed. Never got about 4 hours sleep, and then I drive back up again. So I had a lot of responsibility, especially given that I was only paid £30 a day. But I was getting excited, and you have that sort of energy when you're in your early 20s. And I rushed back to the hotel in the hire car to get my toothbrush or some bits and pieces before I did this drive. And I managed to crash the hire car into a tree. And it was about 3 miles from where they were shooting, and it was completely written off. And so I walked back to the location, and I met up with Lewis Morrow Farrell, who was this very intimidating producer who I'm still in contact with, and John Snell. And I explained there would be no rushes. There would be no rushes transport, and I basically written off the hire car. And that was the last time I worked with John Swanell. And then some years later, I got commissioned to photograph John Swanell, and I wouldn't say we laughed about it, but we put the past where it belongs in the past. But Bailey, interestingly, John Swanell was Bailey's assistant, and so I was able to mention John Swanell. But he was among most of the contemporary photographers that Bailey was a little bit dismissive of. I mean, Bailey's influences are mostly people that are no longer with us. The giants, these iconic
Similar to you.
names. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's still nobody who takes pictures like Irving Penn or Richard Avedon. They're on their own.
And why is that? Will there ever be another Richard Avedon or Irving Penn?
I think part of the problem is that it was harder back then, and so therefore, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so I think working with film and the demands that involves, I think it's quite easy now. And so therefore, there probably are people, there almost certainly are people of that ilk, but maybe they get a lot more lost in the noise.
More competition.
More competition, but just there's too much mediocre stuff. So all the really good stuff gets drowned.
So in answer, well, yeah, with Instagram and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So in answer to, will there ever be another Irving Penn, Richard
Yeah,
Avedon?
there already probably is.
Okay.
Yeah.